Good morning. It's good to see everybody that's here. Can't see you online, but thank you for joining us this morning as we worship the Lord. I want to thank Harold for his comments and for his encouragement and amen, everything he had to say. If we make the effort to reach out to people with the gospel, just as Jesus taught us to do, I know God will bless the effort. And so I want to encourage you to do that at every opportunity and to do your best to make every opportunity. And I know from experience they can be few and far between, and you'll get a lot of no's, a lot of people who don't really want to talk about it. That's all right. We're not looking for those, are we? We're looking for the ones who want to talk about it, and they are out there. I know that's true. How do I know that's true? You're here. You love Jesus, don't you? You wanted the gospel at some point, and there are other people out there who want what we have in him. And so that's what that is all about. Romans chapter 15. Don't miss Habakkuk. And yes, Habakkuk is in the Bible. Put a marker there and keep it marked. But let's go to Romans chapter 15 for just a moment as we start this morning's lesson. This chapter, of course, Paul, when he wrote the letter, didn't divide it up into chapters, but thankfully it's been divided up into chapters since. It makes it easier to study, to find things. But this chapter starts out this way, Romans chapter 15, verse 1. Now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength, and not just please ourselves. Each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification, to build up your neighbor. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. That's from the Psalms. Paul is quoting the Psalms in regard to Christ, talking about those things that were written beforehand. Here in verse 4, whatever was written in earlier times, this text from the Psalms, for example, was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. 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 What does hope do but consistently point us towards a brighter day in the future? That's what hope is all about. And how does Paul say here we come by that? He says you go back to the old Scriptures. The things that were written before were written for our instruction. And they were written in the final analysis so that we might have hope. So we're going back to Habakkuk today. We're going to look at a few things that Habakkuk talks about. Not the entire book. It's so long. My goodness, it's a whole 3 chapters. But we're going to look at some excerpts from Habakkuk and see how what Habakkuk has to say can give us hope. Let's start in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 1. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. See, this is old stuff. It doesn't have anything to do with what's going on today, right? Tell me this couldn't have been written last week about this week. And this is one of God's prophets. This is one of his faithful saying, Lord, how long? Are you not going to take into account what's going on? That's how this book starts. See, it doesn't start on what sounds like a helpful note. But what did Shannon just read for us a little while ago? Well, he read the last part of Habakkuk. And what the last part says is, yeah, there's hope. There's always hope when God is concerned. But we're going to have to work through some things to get to that hope. Look at verse 5. Now this is God talking back to Habakkuk. Habakkuk's been asking, how long are you not going to do anything about this wickedness? And God says, look among the nations, observe, be astonished and wonder, because I'm doing something in your days you would not believe if you were told. And here's what he's doing. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, in other words, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They're dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate within themselves. In other words, they say what's right. They say what's wrong, and you're going to go by our law. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour. And all of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it, and then they sweep through like the wind and pass on. And then that last little part of verse 11, thankfully the Lord put it in there. But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. What's God telling Habakkuk? Well, first of all, what's Habakkuk telling God? Habakkuk is describing the behavior of God's people. Habakkuk is talking to God. He's commiserating all the things that he sees among the people of God, Habakkuk's people. He says, I'm looking around me and all I see is violence and people mistreating and abusing one another. God says, I know. I'm going to do something about it. You're asking me how long? I'm going to do something about it. But if I told you what I was doing, you wouldn't believe me. Well, what do you mean, Lord? What are you going to do? I'm bringing the Babylonians. What? The Babylonians? They're worse than we are. Oh, no. Maybe not. But God has a purpose for the Babylonians, for the Chaldeans. He's going to raise them up. He did raise them up. By the way, this is about 600 years before Christ. God says, I'm raising up the Babylonians to come, and they're going to punish Judah. They're going to punish your people, the ones you're crying out to me about, how unjust they are, how wicked they are, how insidious they are. We don't hear that word much anymore. It's a good word. Pernicious. Well, look that one up. Preachers used to love that word. Why did they love it? Because it was so descriptive of what this is all about, what Habakkuk's talking about his own people. And God says, I know, I see it. That's why I'm raising up the Babylonians. And I knew if I told you about the Babylonians, you wouldn't even believe me, but I'm telling you, I'm doing it. But when that's all done, when the Babylonians have come, when their work of bringing justice on my own people is accomplished, I'm going to call them into account. And that's exactly what God did. Now, we have the benefit of looking back in history and seeing how all of this played out. Habakkuk wasn't the only prophet. There was Jeremiah as well. As a matter of fact, we're going to go keep a finger there in Habakkuk, but I want you to look at a text in Jeremiah in chapter 38, where Jeremiah, contemporary preacher, or preaching, prophying, prophesying. Prophying is a shortened word of prophesying, I think. Maybe that's what that is. He's doing the same kind of work that Habakkuk is, and this is what he says, because Jeremiah is in the royal palace talking to King Zedekiah. Jeremiah 38, verse 17. Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, by the way, Jeremiah is telling this to Zedekiah right after Jeremiah has been pulled out of a pit. They threw him into a pit because they didn't want to hear what he had to say. So they pulled him out of the pit, took him before the king, and Jeremiah says this, thus says the Lord God of hosts, Jeremiah 38, 17. If you will indeed go out to the officers of the king of Babylon, then you will live, this city will not be burned with fire, and you and your household will survive. What is God's message through Jeremiah to Zedekiah? He said, when you see the Babylonians coming, do not fight them. Go out to them. Do you remember when you were a kid and your mom or your dad was about to lay one on you. Now, this is for the older people. I don't think this has happened much in the last 20 or 30 years. It's part of the reason the world is messed up as it is now. Now, you can argue with me on that, but I'm telling you it's the truth. But when us old folks were kids and our parents were about to lay one on us, we knew, don't fight them. You fight them, it's going to be worse. You could wind up in the hospital. And there's no social service going to come for you. Don't fight it. And God is saying to Zedekiah through his prophet Jeremiah, don't fight this. You and your people have been wicked and evil, and I'm bringing judgment on you. Do not fight it. If you'll accept this graciously and in faith, like I want you to do it, it won't be nearly as bad for you as it could be. Isn't it like that when you're facing a just judgment against yourself? If you'll just buckle down and say, you know what, I deserve this. Remember those two thieves on the cross? Both of them initially railed at Jesus, but one of them softened. I don't know what it was that caused him to soften. Maybe it was seeing Jesus go through the crucifixion, 6 hours on the cross, and he watched him go through that. And he never hurled an accusation, never cursed his tormentors. Jesus kept the faith. Maybe that was what turned that man's heart around. Or maybe it was some of the preaching of the kingdom. He had to have heard about the kingdom because he asked Jesus, remember when you come in your kingdom. That guy's heart was turned. But there were two thieves. His is the only one who turned. His is the only one who softened and accepted his punishment. And he told the other thief, we deserve what we're getting. But this man doesn't. What did Jesus tell that man? He said, this day you're going to be with me in paradise. He got it. He figured it out on the cross. It took that long apparently, but he figured it out on the cross. It wasn't too late. It's not too late for you. It's not too late for me to get it figured out. And God is saying through his prophets to his people, judgment's coming. You need to accept it. God's saying through Jeremiah to Zedekiah, accept it. Verse 19. Jeremiah 38, verse 19. Then King Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, I dread the Jews who have gone over to the Chaldeans, for they may give me over into their hand, and they will abuse me. But Jeremiah said, they will not give you over. Please obey the Lord and what I'm saying to you, that it may go well with you and you may live. But if you keep refusing to go out, this is the word which the Lord has shown me. Behold, all the women who've been left in the palace of the king of Judah are going to be brought out to the officers of the king of Babylon. And those women will say, your close friends have misled and overpowered you. While your feet were sunk in the mire, they turned back. They will also bring out all your wives and your sons to the Chaldeans, and you yourself will not escape from their hand, but will be seized by the hand of the king of Babylon, and this city will be burned with fire. What would you wish Zedekiah had done? Don't you wish that this king would have said, you know what? I'm getting a word from the Lord's prophet. I think I'm going to do it. What did he do? He refused. He refused. And the last thing Zedekiah saw before his eyes were put out was the death of his sons in front of him. It was the last thing he saw. When God comes in judgment, he comes in judgment. You can accept the judgment and it'll go a lot easier and you can make it through that judgment, or you can rebel against it. You can kick and squirm and scream and squall, and that'll just make it worse. In one way or another, I think the whole world's going through some judgment right now. It sure at least looks like that. When I see the things going on in our nation and abroad, and I'm not up here to tell you, oh, all of that is the hand of God, but I am saying this. When you read the prophets, you see these kinds of things being done by God in the past. And he's shown us the reason he's done these things in the past is to get people to pay attention, to wise up, to think about him, to think about the way they're living, to take stock. That's what it's all been for in the past. And so I'm wondering, maybe that's what it's for now. Why is California on fire? Our fellow countrymen are losing their homes. Properties being burned up. It's just gone in smoke. Hasn't California been on fire for about the last 10 years? Seems like that, doesn't it? And before then, man, bless their hearts, that whole place was cracking up and breaking off, going into the sea. There's always something going on in California. I'm glad I'm in Oklahoma. Nothing ever happens in Oklahoma, right? And those folks down on the Gulf Coast, have you seen the videos of the storm surge and the homes that have been flooded? How horrible is it to have a house full of water and have to come back and try to rebuild all of that? And what's happening in Haiti, that's just awful. And then you look on the other side of the world in Afghanistan, and our nation's having its face rubbed in the dirt by the way things are going over there. And I could spend the rest of this morning going through a laundry list of things happening in the world that are horrible like this that we may not even know about because maybe the news isn't reporting it right now, but it's happening. And we have, I want to say March of 2020. 2020. March of last year is when all this COVID thing kind of got started, wasn't it? And it's been a mess. And to me, the worst thing is not the plague itself, if you want to call it that, the pandemic. It's that sometimes we get at each other's throats over this because of our opinions on how things ought to be done. And I've got opinions and you've got opinions, but people had opinions about the Chaldeans coming too. The bottom line is, God's going to bring us through this. He brought them through everything that they went through, and He's going to bring us through this. See, I still do that. I just turn away from the microphone that's tied to my neck, and I cleared my throat. Anyway, you know what happened? God sent them into captivity. How long were they in captivity? 70 years. And then God did two things. He fulfilled His promise to bring judgment on Babylon because the Persians came and they wiped out Babylon. And then He fulfilled His promise to restore His people after 70 years of captivity. Cyrus, king of Persia, who just took out the Babylonians, paid with Persian government money to send Jews back to Jerusalem to reestablish the city, to rebuild its walls, to rebuild the temple. It was a government project, but not Jerusalem's government, not Israel's government. It was the Persian government's project. Think about that. Who could have seen that coming? You see, that's the way God's always working. You can never see what God's going to do. Just like He told Habakkuk, I'm doing something that you'd never believe it even if I told you. I'm bringing the Babylonians. Oh, I can't believe that. You're going to bring the Babylonians? How bad is this going to be? Well, just wait until it's over and you'll see how good it can be when it's on the other side. By the way, you got some young men right here in your nation who've not bowed the knee to Baal, as Elijah had said earlier. These guys, I'm going to send them off to Babylon, and I'm going to put them in important offices. One of them's named Daniel. The other one's named Shadrach. The other one's named Meshach. The other one's named Abednego. I'm going to send these three Jewish kids off to Babylon, and they're going to wind up ruling a big part of that country. Wow. You can do that? It's done. It's a done deal. That's the way God works. Well, it's not the first time. You remember Joseph? His brothers hated him so much, they sold him into slavery. He goes down into Egypt as a slave. Finally, everything's okay. Gets a job in Potiphar's house until Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him and starts accusing him of not fraternizing with her, of fraternizing with her because he wouldn't fraternize with her. See, that's the way it happens. He didn't do what she wanted, and so she lied about him. He was thrown into prison. Oh, man, this is horrible. He's in prison. Well, it was in prison that the opportunity came about for him to resolve issues with the dreams of Pharaoh's butler and Pharaoh's baker. And through all of that, it put him in the presence of Pharaoh because God gave Pharaoh a dream. And Pharaoh needed that dream to be interpreted. And who was going to interpret it but Joseph? Nobody could have seen that coming. But that's exactly what happened. It happened with Joseph. It happened with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can't see the end, but God is telling us all the time, oh, the end's going to be good. Wait for the end. All of our popular stories follow this theme, don't they? Things start out really bad. Remember Star Wars, the opening of Star Wars? It's a big battle. The big galactic empire shooting at the little spaceship trying to escape with Princess Leia on it. And they capture Princess Leia and take her on board. And things are looking bad now. And then Luke Skywalker shows up and Darth Vader shows up and says, hey, I'm your daddy. And you know the story, but it's like the rebels, and every story's like that. The good guys are always the underdogs. It always looks like things are going to turn out horrible. Now, is the gospel like this? I mean, the whole totality of the gospel from Genesis to Revelation, is the gospel like that because it's taken the same theme that the movies are going with? Or are our popular movies and popular stories, are they following the same basic pattern that God has set into time and eternity? Yeah, I think that's the way it's happening. And there's something attractive to that. There's something that we're drawn to about that. A story where you know that the end is going to be happily, how? Ever after. But it doesn't start with happily ever after. That's only how it ends. It starts with once upon a time, there was a wicked witch. Once upon a time, there was an evil stepmother. And sometimes she is the wicked witch. Now you understand, they could never say there was a wicked mother because that wouldn't fly. Everybody knows mothers aren't wicked, but a stepmother, stepmothers are different. Now if you're a stepmother, bless your heart, you got a bad rap. But all stories have the evil. And Habakkuk starts out with the evil. Lord, I'm crying out to you and I'm not hearing anything. What's going on? God says, I'm doing something about it, but you wouldn't believe it if I told you. By the way, Habakkuk, let's go to chapter 2 of Habakkuk. In all of this, it looks like God might be talking about Babylon and how evil they are, but he's not talking about the evils of Babylon. He's continually talking about the evils of his own people, Judah, and what he's going to do about it and how they're involved even in idolatry. Look at verse 18 of chapter 2. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Hey, how about that? I pulled it off and cleared my throat. That works. In other words, you've got a guy, as another prophet would say, he goes out into the woods, he selects a tree, he cuts it down, he brings it home. Part of it, he cuts into firewood and he makes a fire and he makes his supper, and the other part he makes into an idol and he bows down and he worships it. That's the logic, that's the reason that he's talking about, and that's what Habakkuk's coming back to here. Verse 19, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And what is your teacher? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver. There's no breath at all inside it. But then he says this in verse 20. What does he say? The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him, because he is not made of wood. He is not overlaid with gold by some man. He is not breathless. He is the God of the universe, and he is in his holy temple, and all the earth needs to shut up and listen. He is God. We are not. He will bring justice when it's time for justice. He will show that there is a judgment that is due, and he will bring it. But those who are faithful will live by their faith. That's what Habakkuk says. The just will live by his faith. And that text is repeated throughout the New Testament. The just will live by his faith. I read this and I think, yeah, idolatry. That's not us. That's an old thing. People used to be idolatrous back in the ancient times. But then I think about us as a nation, as a culture, what do we worship? I mean, you can come up with your own list. Entertainment? I think we worship entertainment to a degree. We worship comfort. We don't want to be uncomfortable. We worship wealth. And of course, you've got to work and make a living. You need to lay by something for the future. You don't know how things are going. But I'm not talking about the normal, biblically supported ideas of using wealth as stewards. That's what Kirk was mentioning when he talked about us having a responsibility of stewardship. I'm talking about making mammon your God. That's what Jesus was addressing. He said, you can't serve God and mammon. And you know, I've talked about before, when I was little, I said, why did it say God and the devil? Because nobody worships the devil. Well, a few people do. But you know anybody that worships money? Worships stuff? Worships comfort? Putting these things above a desire to serve God and have a relationship with Him? Yeah, we've got all kinds of idolatry in the world today. We've got all kinds of idolatry in our culture. So we got issues. In chapter 3, I like what it says in verse 3. By the way, this is a prayer. This is Habakkuk's prayer. And this is what he says in Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 3. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, or Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of His praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. His rays are flashing from His hand, and there is the hiding of His power. Before Him goes pestilence, and plague comes after Him. Can you relate? He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered and the ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. Now, to us, unless we understand the context, it might not mean much to say he's coming out of Teman. Well, Teman was from the south. Now, if you look at a map and you see Babylon's way over to the east of Jerusalem. So we might think that they would be coming from the east. But if you understand the topography, the way to get to Jerusalem from Babylon is to go north. That's the best way to travel because that's the best route to take. And so when they would finally come to Jerusalem, they would come in from the north. And it's almost like God is saying through Habakkuk, yeah, I'm going to bring in judgment from the north, but guess what? I'm coming up from the south. I'm going to resolve this. I'm bringing judgment, but I'm going to resolve this judgment, and it won't last forever. And then you get to the last few verses. This is what Shannon read for us earlier. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 16. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. In other words, there's no way getting out of this. It's coming. And he's upset over it. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olives should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and He has made my feet like hinds' feet, like deer's feet, and makes me walk on my high places. What's the prophet saying? He's saying God's going to bring judgment, but He's going to sustain me through it. And that's where you are, and that's where I am. Whatever is happening in the world, whatever has happened, whatever will happen, whether it's the judgment of God or just the mechanics of the way things work in this place of chaos, God will watch over us through the whole thing. God will be with us. He sends His prophets to let us know I'm with you. I'm taking care of you. Read any of them. Read Joel. Go to read Joel about the judgment that Joel speaks of, but the promise and the hope that Joel gives. It's Joel that Peter quotes on Pentecost. This is that which God promised through the prophet Joel, the outpouring of his Spirit. Read Amos. Amos is the one who says, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I'm coming in judgment on these 7 different nations, and 2 of those nations were Israel and Judah. The people of God are not exempt from judgment when they step out of line. But Amos is also a book filled with hope. All of the prophets who talked about judgment also talked about hope. And we have the benefit of looking back on everything that God has done. And we see he's brought all this judgment, but he gives all this hope, and he always delivers. And then the final analysis, what is our hope? Who's coming back? Not Elvis. Bless his heart, Elvis is dead and gone. I remember they made a movie years ago that said A Night with the King, and I thought, oh, that's all about Elvis. No, it was about Esther. And anyway, that's an aside. We know the Lord's coming back, is he not? Might be today. Mike's planning on preaching tonight. I want to hear that sermon, but the Lord might come before he gets to preach that sermon. You better do something if you're not in Christ today, because the Lord's coming back, and I want you to be happy to see him when he gets here. And that's why this message was preached to Habakkuk. 3 things I'll give you to do. Number 1, I've already talked about it. Take a look at the prophets and see the messages of hope that they've given us. See those messages of hope and see the fact that they didn't even have Christ. And now they made those messages, their prophecies came to be fulfilled. And then Christ came after all of that. Christ came. There's so much hope there. Pray to God. That's number 2. Pray to God for peace in your life to help you see the hope that there is coming and give you peace through these times of trial. And number 3, reach out to your friends and your neighbors and your family who are struggling with what's going on right now. Reach out to them with these messages of peace and hope and security. Let them know that God is sovereign over all, and that he sent Jesus to save us from this world, not to change this world and make this world utopia, but to bring us out of this world through his blood. That's what Jesus has done. Look at the prophets, see their messages. Pray to God for peace and help and comfort and strength, and talk to your neighbors about the Lord, specifically with regard to this peace. That's the message for this morning. I hope it's been a blessing to you as it has to me for preparing it. We're going to stand and sing a song of encouragement and invitation. If you need to respond to that invitation by putting Christ on in baptism, if you need the prayers of this church, we want to ask you to come forward and let us know how we can help while we stand and sing together.